Recently, Virtuos, the studio behind the Switch version of The Outer Worlds, stated, "We now have no doubt that Switch adaptations can be worked for games on any of the current generation of consoles." And perhaps that's true. Virtuos has a solid track record of bringing games to the Switch, but with The Outer Worlds, it quickly becomes clear that perhaps they were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. Yes, The Outer Worlds is one of those ports. Now, there's little doubt that what has been accomplished here is extremely impressive. Virtuos transplanted a high-end Unreal Engine 4 based RPG to a portable system. That it works at all is a remarkable feat, but once you dig in, it becomes clear that perhaps this game is just too much for the Switch to handle. So for this video, we're going to explore the details on what works and what doesn't with this unique conversion while stacking it up against the original release. Is it possible to look beyond the flaws and enjoy the game within? Let's find out. Unreal Engine 4 has a complicated history on the Switch. It's a well-supported platform, and many great games have shipped on this machine utilizing the engine, but the sacrifices are always significant. Sometimes, on the positive side, you get games like Yoshi's Crafted World, which, although it runs at a low resolution, does deliver a smooth 60 frames per second experience. But on the flip side, you get games like Ark Survival Evolved dipping as low as 192p at obscenely low frame rates. So where does The Outer Worlds fit in? Well, in terms of image quality, it's rough. On the surface, the numbers are actually rather reasonable, but not quite where it was suggested to be pre-launch. The publisher recently noted that the game targets 1080p in docked mode and 720p in portable mode, but in reality, those values are extremely uncommon in my findings. In fact, based on my pixel counts, in docked mode at least, the game runs around 720p most of the time. Switch to portable mode, however, and the average resolution drops to 540p, with dips as low as roughly 384p. So the typical resolution is below what was promised, but still slightly higher than your typical Unreal Engine game on Switch. The problem is that the game is simply too blurry, and this is especially troublesome in portable mode, where it becomes genuinely difficult to discern what you're looking at. This is down somewhat to the TAA implementation. The problem is that The Outer Worlds features such large environments with a vast draw distance that your eyes are naturally drawn to the horizon, yet the lower resolution ensures that it's difficult to make out any detail. But sacrifice is the name of the game here. That's what it takes to bring a game like this to the Switch, and this becomes most evident once we dive into comparisons with the original version. For this video, I've decided to use the Xbox One X version of the game as the control group against the Switch version, which will be judged. The first and most significant change stems from a massive reduction in detail across the board. Model complexity, texture resolution, and overall density is radically altered. Textures are perhaps the first thing you'll notice here. The original PBR materials from the initial release are gorgeous, with a lot of micro detail evident throughout. This lends the game a pseudo-realistic appearance despite the fantasy setting. Now, the Switch port attempts to retain the basic look, but actual asset resolution has been dropped to work within the limitations of the platform. I think this is a case where the sheer volume and quality of the assets is just beyond the scope of what can realistically be done on this platform. But there's plenty of great looking games on the Switch, so what's the issue? Well, as I see it, these assets just weren't designed artistically to be viewed in this way. What we're looking at is a reduction in quality rather than original assets designed for the Switch. As a consequence of this, the game looks somewhat uglier than comparable titles on Xbox 360 and PS3. In fact, this is kind of what I would imagine a PlayStation 3 conversion of Fallout 4 may have looked like. Walk up to any surface in the game and it's immediately clear that just so much detail is lost, and you will see this throughout the game. Now, it technically works, like I've said, but it really just doesn't look good. Solving this problem would require a more significant change to the art design to accommodate for the lower spec hardware. Simply reducing asset quality this far doesn't work. And the same is true of the underlying geometry as well. Everything is simplified. from rock formations to pieces of the ship to buildings and beyond. It feels as if the entire game effectively uses a higher LOD level. So during exploration, the entire game world is just slathered in low-resolution blurry textures and lots of angular geometry that sort of pops in as you play, something we'll discuss shortly. Now, of course, both of these issues also apply to character models as well, which see a reduction in geometry and texture detail. This results in more angular-looking characters with weird clipping artifacts in some cases, and generally smeary-looking outfits. This isn't as egregious a change as the environmental detail, I might say, but it's still rather noticeable. What's worse, these dialogue sequences are further limited by the lack of depth of field. This beautiful bokeh depth of field effect is used in other versions of the game, and it's simply absent on Switch, which can often produce awkward results, especially when assets fail to load in. Which brings us to our next problem, pop-in. It is severe and it is constant. Textures and models alike are often slow to pop into existence to the point where it can take upwards of 10 seconds or more at various points. When in its low detail state, it almost feels like you're running around Google Earth in Street View with a partially loaded map on a 10-year-old Chromebook. There's even an intermediate step between the lowest quality assets and the highest quality assets too, and you'll get plenty of time to see them all. Beyond this, while exploring the world, there's moments when it simply pauses like this, with these spinning circles to indicate that the game is loading. It happens a lot. But here's the thing, when you first start playing the game, these issues don't seem so severe, which is a perfect example of why first impressions aren't always the most reliable. You see, similar to something like, say, Skyrim on PlayStation 3, the game gets worse as you play it. Everything starts to load slower and it just runs worse. Now, just to be sure, I tested the game on all 4 of my Switch consoles, and that includes both internal memory and from an SD card. It was the same in all instances. So yeah, when it comes to detail and loading, the game has a lot of problems, but there are other changes as well. While objects that are rendered often exhibit less detail, many other objects are skipped altogether, which honestly is a fair trade-off, but it's still rather noticeable. This means that rocks, trees, and grass will often be just skipped on the Switch. Fields of foliage now appear as empty, blurry, textured spaces. Or how about this path to a nearby settlement? On Xbox, this area is filled with trees and foliage, and it looks very lush. On Switch, however, it feels more like exploring a desert. The entire scene looks completely different. But, as I suggested, this is kind of a reasonable thing to expect in a Switch port, and simply eliminating objects doesn't ruin the visuals in the same way that lowering texture and object detail can. Beyond this, there are a couple other visual effects that have been reduced or removed. For instance, the volumetric cloud system from the original game appears to be completely absent on the Switch. It certainly never appeared in my game on any of my systems, so I think it's fair to say it's not here. The sky is always clear. Beyond that, ambient occlusion also appears to have been removed, leading to less ambient shadowing across the world, something especially noticeable in rock formations. But at the same time, they didn't strip out everything. For instance, when speaking to characters, the developers place a light behind the head of the character to help light the scene. This showcases the subsurface scattering technique used on characters, allowing light to penetrate the skin more realistically. And surprisingly, this is intact on Switch, at least in some scenes, like this one, but in others, it's missing, so it's kind of a mixed bag, I suppose. Screen space reflections and screen space shadows are both still present on Switch as well, though they have been slightly reduced in quality. The point is, though, sacrifices had to be made. There was no other way to get a game like this running on Switch without significant sacrifices. The problem is that those sacrifices are simply too great, and we're left with a game that just doesn't look good enough. And the reason it doesn't look good enough comes down to the changes made to the assets. I play a lot of retro games. I have no problems going back to even PlayStation 1 style 3D visuals. It's not a problem. What is a problem is when you take something designed for one platform and mangle it to the point where it just looks unfinished, and that's what's happened here. But by now, you've already seen the visuals in action compared to the Xbox One X version, so the question becomes a little more personal, I suppose. If you feel the visuals hold up even with these sacrifices, perhaps it will get the job done. After all, the underlying game is still fantastic, and yes, it's technically playable here on the Switch. The problem is, for me at least, the atmosphere of this world is critical to enjoying a game like this, so the reduction in visual quality has a huge impact on the overall experience. But here's the thing, even I could deal with these limitations if the frame rate were at least rock solid, or reasonably close to it. As it turns out, however, it's not quite what I'd hoped there either. There's really two problems here, effectively. There are the typical performance drops you get when the system is being stressed, and there are some frame pacing issues. By default, The Outer Worlds is designed to target 30 frames per second, and initially, it seems like it might actually get there. But as you begin to play the game, more and more, it starts to fall apart. So let's talk about the first issue, bad frame pacing. Now, things are often stable in certain areas, and it would seem as the frame pacing is fine, but as the load increases, you'll begin to notice these interruptions along the frame time graph, with 16 millisecond spikes and 50 millisecond dips. As is always the case when this occurs, this reduces the overall sense of fluidity. At first, I thought it was just normal slowdown, but in reality, it's an issue with these variable frame times, and it pops up fairly often. So right away, it's clear that there are some issues to work on here. But it's the actual drop in performance that is a whole lot more frustrating. While wandering the landscape, it's honestly not that bad, as long as there isn't anything overly complex on screen, though even sometimes it can be okay there as well. If you're only sampling the game for a short period of time, you may even encounter a stretch where the frame pacing and frame rate are completely stable. It feels great when this occurs. But as you move into more detailed areas, everything starts to drop. Sometimes just a little bit, but often it really begins to lurch. It also becomes increasingly common the longer you play the game. Basically, I found that many areas just could not hold that 30 frames per second target at all, even when there wasn't a whole lot happening. This is a problem as it makes exploration a lot less enjoyable. For me, the constant fluctuations just create visual distractions. But as you might guess, combat is a whole lot worse. Engage enemies in just about any area in the game and the frame rate begins to sputter so hard that it becomes difficult to play the game. Nearly every combat encounter will result in a noticeable loss in performance. Combat just never feels good as a result, and it becomes difficult to even aim your weapon. Now keep in mind that The Outer Worlds was never an amazing shooter to begin with, so when you couple in the frame rate issues, everything just sort of falls apart. Things get especially bad when dealing with large crowds of enemies. Take this one scene here inside the game's first town, for instance, which drops into the low 20s and sometimes even worse. I think it's this combination of complex environments combined with multiple foes running around along with your friendly AI that proves too much for the poor old Switch to handle. But it's similar outside in a completely different area as well. Check this part out. It's a really common occurrence throughout, and it just kind of kills the combat experience. The only time when things play out at a reasonable rate is when you're exploring the indoor areas or dungeons. In this case, things run a whole lot smoother and it's not as large of an issue, but anytime you engage with the enemy outdoors, things go pretty bad. The thing is, this isn't really all that different from, say, a last generation Bethesda game like Fallout 3 or Oblivion or even Skyrim. If you could tolerate that, this is comparable. This is simply how these games used to run on a console, but we've largely moved beyond this with current generation machines, save for games like Fallout 4, which really didn't run very well. But The Outer Worlds does. It's very consistent on Xbox One X. So I suppose the next question then is about portable mode. How does it run? Well, the answer is, it's much the same, especially in combat. These moments when the resolution drops and the frame rate enters the toilet zone are just too common. It's really not a great experience. And that's the thing. I could more easily accept the compromised visuals if the frame rate had at least been relatively steady, but it's not. The game looks and plays poorly on Switch, period. Which is really the root of the issue. Yes, this port exists. The studio responsible for its conversion did indeed do its job. The problem is, when you say you can port everything, you really need to consider what that actually means in the end. What does the end product look like? In this case, it's just not good enough. It's Outer Worlds, sure, but it's nowhere near the quality of any other version. Portability is not enough to save the day here, in my opinion. Now, I recognize the huge challenges faced by the team, and in that sense, I do respect their efforts. Getting a memory-hungry game like this running on the Switch, that's impressive. But at the same time, I really can't recommend this conversion at all. This is a bad version of The Outer Worlds, and only those with a very high tolerance for low frame rates and poor visuals need apply. If you were someone that was okay with something like Borderlands 2 on the PS Vita, this is the game for you. Hey, at least it's not as bad as Ark Survival Evolved. Still, even with its flaws, I am weirdly glad that it exists. This type of port is one of my favorite things to cover. These difficult ports are so interesting. I love seeing hardware run something that punches well beyond what it should be capable of. It's akin to porting, say, the original Crysis to a PlayStation 3. It was never going to be a great way to play Crysis, but it was always going to be interesting. I should note, though, that that port of Crysis to PS3 does still look a lot better than Outer Worlds on Switch. And at this point, I haven't even touched on things like loading times yet, which is another sticking point. Though mercifully, they are much shorter than the loading times in Ark Survival Evolved. But you do spend a lot of time waiting between big areas. Anytime you transition to a town, or your ship in fact, you have to wait. This was already a problem on Xbox One X, and it's even more of a problem here on the Switch. So that's basically where we're at then. This is not a great version of The Outer Worlds, but as I said, it is an interesting one. To me, it's a perfect demonstration of why not every game needs to be on the Switch. Sometimes the sacrifices necessary to achieve this just aren't worth it. And that's definitely the case here. So approach with caution. But I think that's going to do it for now, so if you did enjoy this video or at least found it helpful, be sure to give us a like, subscribe, follow us on Twitter, you know the drill. And until next time, this is John signing off.